Okay, good morning, everyone. Can I welcome everyone back after the recess period? Michael McMahon is, I thought I was him entering the room. It is not. It is still delayed, hence I'm in the chair for the beginning of this morning's meeting. Can I welcome the Cabinet Secretary for Infrastructure, Investment and Cities, her officials and those in the public gallery to the 12th meeting of the Welfare Reform Committee. As is customary, can I remind everyone to turn off their mobile phones and other electronic devices. And before we move on to the main items on our agenda this morning, we have two short pieces of administrative business to take care of. Agenda item 1 is declaration of interests, and can I welcome Ian Gray, MSP, to the committee, and as it is your first time at the committee, Ian, can I invite you to make any declarations of interest relevant to the committee's remit?
Nothing to declare, Convener.
That was very brief and to the point. Thank you very much, Mr Gray. Agenda item 2, the purpose of this agenda item is to invite the committee to agree to take agenda items in private later in the meeting. Specifically, the committee is invited to agree that consideration of agenda items 5, 6, 7 and 8 are all taken in private. These agenda items will focus on proposals for possible future external meetings and visits, commissioning research, potential future witnesses, and to discuss the evidence heard at today's meeting. Do members agree to take these items in private? Agreed. We are all agreed. Okay, in that case, I turn to agenda item 3. It's our first substantive item of business today regarding passported benefits and the social fund. We have the Cabinet Secretary and her officials in place, and you're very welcome to the committee. And can I ask the Cabinet Secretary if she would like to make a brief opening statement before I open for questions?
Yes, thank you very much. I certainly welcome the opportunity to update the committee today on the emerging themes from our consultation of passported benefits, and also to give an update on our plans for successor arrangements for the social fund. Firstly, on the consultation, we received 84 responses to the consultation from quite a wide range of respondents. I think that's a good level of response and one that is encouraging. We expect to publish the analysis of the responses in December, but very early unvalidated impressions from the responses show a general support for the principles we outlined, maintaining access and budgets for passported benefits. They also suggest a lack of support for the concept of cashing up, and suggestions that information on availability on passported benefits should be improved. As soon as we've got the analysis, I'll make sure that the committee gets a report on that, and I'd be more than happy to come back to the committee to discuss it in more detail at that time. If I can just comment on our proposed legislative solution for income-based passported benefits. I have written to the committee to update on this. I wrote on the 16th of October. The fact is, and it's a regrettable fact as far as I'm concerned, there is ongoing uncertainty regarding the information that will be available in Universal Credit Awards notifications. That's got big implications for how we then set criteria for income-based passported benefits for the short term. My letter to the committee set out my thinking on this, and my officials are currently exploring the practicalities of implementing the workaround that was highlighted in the letter. I certainly welcome the committee's views on that proposal, but my thinking at this stage is that the approach we're intending to take will lead to better outcomes in policy terms and give us a better degree of confidence about achieving our goal of protecting access for current claimants of passported benefits. The committee will also be aware of the passported benefits consultation events we're running with stakeholders. The first of these was held yesterday, and I will ensure that the committee receives the write-ups from these events as soon as they're available. If I can turn briefly, Convener, to successor arrangements for the social fund. I also had given a commitment to the committee to update on progress here, and can confirm today our intention to introduce a Scottish Welfare Fund to replace the Social Fund. Social Fund, of course, comprises crisis loans for crisis grants for living expenses and community care grants for helping vulnerable people live independently. As you'll be aware, we've agreed a partnership approach with COSLA, following input from a design and implementation group which comprises the government, COSLA and local authority representatives, and an informal consultation process over the summer. We agreed the outline of the new Scottish Welfare Fund earlier this month. So that means that we are very firmly on track to have the new fund in place for next April. And just say a quick word about funding of the new fund. The funding for the new scheme has been transferred to Scottish ministers from the UK Government. The funding that will come to us is in three parts. Firstly, set-up costs. Secondly, ongoing administrative costs. And thirdly, programme spend. Despite DWP previously agreeing to meet the burdens associated with the new scheme, I received a letter from the relevant minister on the 6th of August which detailed that the proposed funding for set-up costs would only be £240,000, which is a figure that falls far short of the bid we put forward. So we've written back to Steve Webb, who's the relevant minister, to express our disappointment and to challenge that figure. So we'll keep the committee updated on progress with that. I think it's fair to say we're also disappointed with the level of funding to be transferred for programme spend. However, notwithstanding that, we have agreed with COSLA that the programme spend will be ring-fenced and it will be passed on in full to local authorities. I'm also pleased to be able to inform the committee that because we think the amount being transferred is too low, the amount that will transfer to us is actually less than was spent on the social fund in 2005. Because of that, the government has taken a decision to provide an additional £9.2 million for local authorities to spend on that scheme and to supplement the money being transferred by the UK Government. And basically that increased funding means that the Scottish Welfare Fund will have the capacity to award an additional 5,500 community care grants and over 100,000 additional crisis grants. It will, in other words, almost double the number of people in Scotland who will be able to receive either a community care grant or a crisis grant next year. So I think that probably is all I need to say just now, Convener, by way of update, and I'm happy to go into any of these points in more detail with the committee.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary, and can I apologise for any discourtesy you felt me not being here. A combination of fog and broken down cars on the M8 prevented me getting here on time, so my apologies for, and to the committee for not being able to be here as he kicked off. I'll just, if you're happy, Cabinet Secretary, just to open it up to questions from members, and they can ask you about the comments that you've made and anything that's in the helpful briefing that you gave us prior to the meeting commencing this morning. Annabelle.
Thank you, Convener. I would like to explore further with the Cabinet Secretary what is happening with the timescale for the DWP in producing the awards notification. She referred to uncertainty, continuing uncertainty in this respect. And indeed, I believe the last time the Cabinet Secretary was here, again, it was the same kind of scenario, that there was continuing uncertainty from the UK Government via the DWP. I just wonder if there is any indication of when we may get the final picture from the UK Government in order that we can make our consequential arrangements.
I think it's fair to say we don't yet have absolute certainty or even any certainty around when we will get this information, which if I can be as diplomatic as possible, is extremely frustrating, because obviously we are working to tight timescales to make sure that we have arrangements in place that can continue eligibility for people who are currently entitled to passported benefits. I mean, some of the background to this, in fact, all of the background to this was set out in my letter to the committee. We had previously understood that the award notices for universal credit would have a reference to the benefits that claimants had previously been on, which would have given us a very easy way to look at and determine who previously was entitled to passported benefits. That's now not the intention of the DWP. What we think they are now looking to do is to have earnings thresholds on the award notices, but we haven't yet seen what form that will be in. That means we would, I think, be struggling to put in place for April next year the substantive regulations that would detail how we intend to do this. We don't clearly need to do that by April. What we need to do by April is make sure that if anybody on the Pathfinder scheme was in Scotland, they would have access, and the workaround that we are looking at allows us to do that and gives us a bit longer to have the substantive regulations in place in time for October, when the rollout of universal credit starts proper. Obviously, in order to properly inform how we go about ensuring continued access by October next year, we need more information than we have just now, not just of the form of the award notice, but of what categories of claimant will first be migrated to universal credit, because that obviously informs or will inform our thinking about how to proceed from that time. I mean, I will keep the committee fully informed and updated. So as soon as we have more information on this from the DWP, I will make sure the committee has that, and at any point where we have more information to go on to inform our thinking, I'll be happy to come back and share that, and hear the views and take the questions from the committee members.
Thank you.
Jamie and then Alex.
It's just a follow-up specifically to that evidence. I mean, clearly it would have been very helpful if the award letters from the DWP had listed the previous benefits, and if they'd signalled that was their intention. Presumably there was a degree of planning on that basis. Now, if that's no longer the case, have they said why that might no longer be the case?
I think they've just, for perhaps reasons best known to themselves, have changed their minds on that. I'm not aware we know of any other rationale for it. It still seems to me to be a sensible way forward, and the most efficient way of making that transition from universal credit, from the current scenario to universal credit, and keeping the people who are currently entitled to access passported benefits with that entitlement. Obviously, they've changed their minds on that, and we need to work with that. So the sooner we can get clarity on the form of the award letters and the order in which particular groups of claimants are being migrated onto the new system, the sooner we'll be able to inform our own thinking.
They seem to be very good at changing their minds a lot, but not so good at the communication.
Indeed.
That's a very appropriate place for me to bring in my supplementary, and it was about channels of communication. In a much earlier stage in this process, the Minister made it clear that channels of communication with London were quite open and were working quite well. More recently, that appears not to have been necessarily the case. Can I ask the Minister whether she believes that channels of communication have been weakened as a result of the Cabinet reshuffle which took place, whether there is a continuing good relationship or whether that relationship requires further work in order to achieve the objectives that you have currently?
I think what I said, and obviously I don't have the official report in front of me, so forgive me if I get this wrong in any way. I think what I said last time was that the channels of communication were not the problem. It was what was being said through those channels of communication, or what was not being said through those channels of communication. The reshuffle, if you're talking about the Scottish Government reshuffle, hasn't had a bearing on this, because I was responsible for this before the reshuffle, and I'm still responsible for it now.
Can I specifically say that I was referring to the reshuffle that happened in the Westminster Government?
My apologies.
Because there have been a significant change of personnel within the Ministry.
I wouldn't suggest here that that's, as far as I'm concerned, had a bearing on this. The lines of communication are there with the DWP. We try very hard, as I'm sure do they, to make sure these lines of communications are open. I think the problem is the lack of information that's coming down those channels of communication, and that's been the frustration all along, and it remains the frustration.
Can I just clarify then, do you believe that lines of communication are functional at the moment, but with the qualification, as you said, that you're not satisfied with the information you're receiving?
I think when you're dealing with a situation like we have just now, where a UK government department is implementing massive policy changes that have a massive impact on devolved responsibilities, I guess it will always be the case where we need to continue to work at these channels of communication and make sure they're as good as they could be. But I genuinely don't think it's because we're not, and I know it's not because my officials and ministers are not trying to get the information. Believe me, we are. It is simply the fact that there is still an well, it's maybe not fair for me to say an underdevelopment, because I don't know the state of development within the DWP about these things, but there's certainly an communication of some of the critical bits of information that we need in order to inform our own policy making. And when you have a situation where we don't know what information is going to be on the award letters, and we don't yet know the categories of claimants that will first be migrated as of October next year, we don't yet know what level universal credit is going to be set at. These are pretty big gaps in the information picture, and I guess I would just continue to urge the DWP to give us and to fill in these gaps as quickly as possible.
You've already said in an answer to Annabel a few minutes ago that you feel that your process of development is being held back by the lack of information. Can you put a time scale? How much delay is already in the system?
Well, I had hoped that we would have regulations in place by the 1st of April next year that would give clarity about how existing claimants of passported benefits would continue to access passported benefits. I'm no longer able to say that because I don't have the kind of information we've been talking about. So it will be October next year that we now have to have these regulations in place. Now, we have to have them in place by then in order to fulfil our policy objective of maintaining access and maintaining eligibility, but presumably the DWP have to have that detail in place in time for that as well, because that's the start point for the rollout of universal credit.
And just to complete the questions on timescale, given that you have to develop your regulations to conform with the regulations that are developed in the South, how quickly do you need them, and how far behind will you be with the development of them?
Well, we are already behind. We will lodge regulations as soon as we have the information to enable us to put them together and lodge them. In order to get them in place for October, we need to introduce them by June next year. So we had intended to introduce regulations in February for April. It will now be introducing them in June for October. That's the kind of broad timescale we're now working to.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Kevin.
Thank you, Convener. First of all, can I comment on the communication side and what has just been said here? Because obviously we're talking a little bit highfalutin terms here in terms of when regulations will come into being. Meanwhile, out there, those folks who are currently in receipt of passported benefits are probably quite worried at the fact that we're not able to deal with regulations and may have that fear that benefits may be withdrawn. Could we have the assurance that these delays caused by the DWP will not lead to anyone losing their passported benefits?
Well, I'm happy to give the assurance again, as I have done in Parliament and I think to this committee previously, that the clear intention of the Scottish Government is to continue eligibility and access to passported benefits for people who currently get them, and that is our absolute intention. That's our duty and obligation to these people, many of whom will be amongst the most vulnerable people in Scotland. The question that I can't answer just now because of the lack of information is how administratively we will make that happen, but there is absolutely no dilution of the political and policy objective of the government in that regard.
Convener, I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that, and although it is a reiteration, I think it's vital that we keep putting that on the record. I wonder if I could turn to the comments that you made round about the set-up costs for the now Scottish Welfare Fund. I think you said, Cabinet Secretary, that the Minister Steve Webb has allocated £240,000 in set-up costs. And you said that was a big difference from what was asked for. Do you have any idea of what we actually asked for, what that difference is? And is there a difficulty in other areas where we are trying to get money to set up other schemes because of the changes that are taking place?
In terms of the set-up costs, our estimate of the set-up costs and what we said that would be to the DWP was in the region of £5 million. So we've been, as you can see, offered a fraction of that. Now, obviously, we've been having further discussions with them, looking at how we can get down our estimate so that we're doing it as efficiently and cost effectively. They've agreed to look at it again. So I'm hopeful that we will get to a better position than the one we're in just now, where we will end up on that obviously remains to be seen, but we are working hard to get to a more realistic estimate of what the set-up costs are, or rather a more realistic agreement from the DWP about the amount they will transfer for that.
Thank you. Convener, I think in terms of this aspect, in terms of set-up costs, it may well be that we as a committee should actually write to the Minister as well, saying that if we are to implement these things here, we actually require the funding to do so. So I think we could maybe back up the government in that regard as a committee to try and see if we can get more of the cash that's required for set-up.
Take that on board, Kevin. We
Thank you,
discuss,
Convener.
What we do from it. Linda,
I think Mr Grays was on that specific.
you want to come in on the back of that? Then?
Well, I wanted to ask some questions about the
That's
guidance around the Scottish Welfare Fund, the successor to Social Fund, and it is my first time at the committee, so this may be something that the committee have discussed with the Cabinet Secretary before, but around the Social Fund, as well as guidance, there's a lot of case law and there are regulations which carry the force of law. We've got here the draft guidance for local authorities under the Scotland Act, Section 20, and I understand that. But I'm not sure about what the force of the guidance will be, because at the moment, those who apply for the social fund have some protection in law in that they have an entitlement because of the case law which has taken place. And I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary envisages there being regulations which would actually provide not just access to the new fund, but actually entitlements under that fund.
Well, I appreciate Ian is new to the committee. We've had some discussion about this in the past. The scheme we're putting in place from April next year is deliberately intended to be a transitional scheme. We decided to go down that road partly because of some of the issues we've been talking about in terms of timescales and us getting information and being able to translate that into policy. So what we've agreed with local authorities is we will put in place a transitional scheme under the power of general wellbeing with clear guidance to local authorities. That will be in place for a 2-year period. We'll learn lessons from the operation of that, and then it is our intention to put the long-term scheme, which will be based on this. It may or may not have some alterations depending on the experience of administering it for 2 years. We'll put that in legislation, so it will become a statutory scheme for the longer term. In terms of that interim period, we've reached agreement with local authorities that we will provide, as I said earlier on, the funding that's been transferred from the DWP, that will be ring-fenced. It will all go to local authorities. It will, as I've also said, be topped up by the 9.2 million additional resources. Local authorities, for their part, are agreeing that they will abide by that guidance. There will be a standard application form. So, yes, it's guidance, and I readily admit that at that stage, but we have an agreement with local authorities that that is the guidance by which they will all abide. And, as I say, longer term, it will be our intention to put the scheme onto a statutory footing.
But I suppose I wonder to what degree you've been able to explore two dangers in that. One is that in the transitional period, then those who are, seeking support from the fund actually have a lesser entitlement than they have at the moment, because I don't think that's the intention of the Scottish Government, because there's now a greater degree of discretion for local authorities and therefore less entitlement. Or that whatever scheme the Scottish Government might plan in the long run, because there is already case law. So, for example, when we look at prioritisation, a high priority is defined as an item which has a substantial and immediate effect in resolving or improving the circumstances of the applicant. Now, substantial and immediate are terms which have been tested in social security law in the past. I mean, is there a danger that that case law then, as an unintended consequence, is kind of carried over into the new scheme, rather than what the government and this Parliament would like to see in the operation of the scheme?
This is not a perfect world
No.
we're operating in, and I suppose that's my kind of general comment here. We are being driven to a much greater extent than I would want us to be by policy decisions that are being taken elsewhere. So what we are making every effort to do is put in place, in place of what has gone before in the Westminster scenario, arrangements that are fit for purpose, that deliver our policy objectives and deliver continuity for people, particularly in relation to passported benefits, but also in terms of the social fund successor arrangements. We will be working very hard with local authorities in that spirit of partnership to avoid the risks and the dangers that you point out, and I can give you that absolute assurance. Clearly, having that transitional scheme in place for 2 years gives us the ability, as we draw up the legislation that puts it on a statutory footing, to learn any lessons from that. There are advantages in having a scheme that is devolved to Scotland, administered under national guidance, but administered on a local basis, because it allows local authorities, in a way they've not been able to do before with the social fund, to merge it much more into the other forms of support that they can provide for vulnerable people, so that it doesn't exist in isolation. It can be part of a package of support. So I think we should take the opportunity to design and implement a system that works for our arrangements. I can't sit here and say, and I wouldn't sit here and say that Ian Gray is not raising concerns that have any legitimacy, because he is, but we'll be working very hard with local authorities to make sure the scheme works as we intend, and learn any lessons we need to as we move to put it onto that statutory footing.
One of the biggest imperfections in the imperfect world, surely, is that, in a sense, this is a demand-led need, but it's a cash-limited fund. And I appreciate the point that the Cabinet Secretary you've made, that you have extended that fund, you've provided additional funding from that that's been devolved. But nonetheless, it's still a finite resource, and one of the criteria for rejecting an application is that there are no funds left. Now, that's not new. That's true of the social fund at the moment. However, it's also true that any rejected application to the social fund at the moment allows someone to ask for a review, and then indeed for an independent review. And I appreciate that Tier 2 review the Scottish Government are still working on. But in terms of the Tier 1 review, the guidance says that an application which is rejected on the basis of lack of funds has no right to a review. And it seems to me that's a huge shift in power to the award-making authority, which in this case is local authorities. They will be able to reject an application on the basis that no funds are available, and there is, in this guidance, no process of review to ensure that actually they've carried that decision out correctly. And I just wonder why that's there.
The guidance is not finalised, so these are points I'm happy to consider in terms of the final guidance. It is a cash limited fund. That's what it has always been. It's what it will continue to be. It's less cash limited than it would be if we were just taking the transferred funds. I have figures here only going back to 2005-06, but with the additional resources the Scottish Government is committing, the fund will be bigger than it has been in any of the years back to 2005-06. So we are recognising the fact that, given the times we live in just now, demand for a fund like that is likely to be rising. As I say, the extra resources will allow us to double the award. So that's the point about cash. I take your point that even if the reason for refusal is a lack of funds, there may still be a need for an administrative review of how that decision has been taken. So I'm happy to take that point away as we finalise the guidance and give further consideration to it.
Yeah, it was just still on the Social Welfare Fund. I'm aware that April 2013 is not that far away now, and given that there have been issues about getting information at the very root of all of this that must feed through, I wondered if there is a view on how ready local authorities are to be taking this additional responsibility.
Well, we've been working very closely with local authorities. The design and implementation group that I referred to has brought together government, COSLA, local authority representatives. So we've worked on the agreement between ourselves and COSLA around the transfer of the funding and the guidance, etc. And we'll continue to do that. I have to say, COSLA have worked with us and local authorities have worked with us very constructively. There is a shared desire to get these arrangements up and running and working properly, and we'll continue to work with local authorities to make sure they're ready to do this when they need to, which is by April next year.
I'm aware too that not all local authorities have their own money advice service, for example. And again, like Ian, fairly new to the committee, so a lot of this ground may have been covered before. I just wonder, again, whether there is a feeling in government that there's been good communication amongst local authorities with other organisations in their areas that deal with these issues, like Citizens Advice Bureau being, for example, a very obvious one.
I think that's a good point, and I think there does need to continue to be communication like that. I mean, I guess I've kind of mentioned this briefly in response to Ian's point. One of the big advantages of having this fund devolved and putting local authorities in the lead in terms of administering the fund is the ability it gives them to join it up with other forms of advice. So if somebody's coming for a crisis grant, they're not just being given a crisis grant, they can be offered help with budgeting or, you know, money advice or, you know, help to resolve some of the underlying problems that may have led them to seek a crisis grant. So it does give the ability to put what is now the welfare fund into that bigger package of support that councils are able to offer, and that will necessitate councils learning from each other and working with other organisations, third sector organisations in particular, who provide that advice.
Thank you.
Back to you, Jamie, before I ask a couple of questions myself.
Thank you, Convener. Obviously, there was the written consultation, Cabinet Secretary. I'm wondering if you can maybe tell us a little bit more what was said, what people who took part in the consultation were saying, and how that's going on to inform any success arrangements that are put in place.
You're talking about the social fund consultation,
The one that got the 84 responses.
As the passported benefits consultation. I mean, broadly speaking, as I said in my opening remarks, we'll be doing a full analysis of the consultation and we'll pass that to the committee as soon as it's available. We would expect to have it available in December. What I'm about to say, as I said in my opening remarks, is unvalidated. So, you know, forgive me if the final consultation analysis might show something different. But generally speaking, what we saw was a support for the principles we outlined, and the principles we outlined were maintaining access to and budgets for passported benefits. So, in other words, not taking the welfare changes as an opportunity to rationalise or change dramatically the type of people who would be entitled to passported benefits. That got a lot of support. We had put forward, because, you know, some people make this argument, the concept of cashing up, where, you know, passported benefits are kind of combined into a sort of cash payment for claimants. There was not a lot of support for that notion, although we'll be able to further analyse that as we do the full analysis. Some respondents said, and I've got a lot of sympathy with this, is that there needed to be a better quality of information on the availability of passported benefits. And again, I think as we put in place the new arrangements, we have an opportunity to do that, to make sure people know what's available. There was a lack of consensus on a couple of other things, you know, for example, whether income levels should be assessed at a household or an individual level. And a feeling, which I share, that the government and that there is an opportunity here to move in the medium term to a more coherent system of benefits, passported benefits. I mean, we've talked before at previous committee sessions, and this is not me saying that I'm for or against any particular passported benefit, but the system of passported benefits has grown up in a pretty ad hoc way. There's not been a lot of rhyme or reason behind it. We have an opportunity, certainly in the medium to long term, I think, to look at how we make that more coherent than it might be just now. So these are the kind of headline findings, but there will be more detail as we go forward. I think I previously sent detail on the numerical breakdown. You know, one MSP responded, I'm not sure who they were. 18 local authorities, 46 third sector organisations, 9 members of the public, and 10 other responses. So that's the breakdown of the total number.
And presumably dialogue, particularly with clearly dialogue with local authorities will be ongoing.
Absolutely.
But the third sector, presumably that remains an ongoing
Yes,
issue.
I mean, the third sector, we may come back onto this, I suppose, in the next section. I mean, the third sector are very rightly, very concerned about, as I am, as all of you are, about the impact of the welfare changes and in terms of how that translates into demand for their services. So yes, we are talking to the third sector. I met recently with Citizens Advice to to look and discuss how they respond and how we can best support them in responding.
Thank you.
Annabelle.
Yes, thank you, Kavita. Just going back to the social fund, I know, and it's indeed a conversation that the committee has had in the past. Kevin Stewart particularly was leading on this, which was the issue of access to data, DWP data. And I note that in terms of the bare bones of the proposals for the new scheme, that local authorities are to have the required access to DWP data to check information provided by applicants. And I just wonder where we were in that, because we had, as I say, had a previous discussion in committee where we weren't entirely convinced that was a sort of seamless system now or shortly to be in place, and as far as DWP developments are concerned.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say that the principles of that are all in place and agreed. There is still work ongoing around the mechanics of exactly how local authorities will access that data, but I'm not at this stage concerned that we've got a problem there. If that changes, I'll let the committee know of that.
Thank you.
Cabinet Secretary, can I ask you a question for clarification? I've been talking to, as you have, obviously, the third sector organisations. But one of the organisations I was talking to this week gave me some statistics around the community grants and crisis loans and the changes in the funding for that. And the figures that they had was that in 2010-11, the figure was £38 million that had been available. They're now saying that because of changes to criteria, now moving to our only 3 applications in a 12-month period, those kind of changes, you can't no longer get white goods like cookers or fridges unless it's in the situation of a disaster like a fire or a flood, that the fund has actually been reduced down to around 25 million. Now, I know that you have put additional funding forward, but I think the impression out there is that, well, you have put more money available to that the DWP have cut it back to. It's still less than was available. Is that the reality?
I've got figures here going back to 2005-06. I'm happy to share these with the committee. You mentioned 2010-11. The total expenditure on the social fund was £29 million. 29. I'm trying to work out. £29.5 million. I think that is 20 million of that on community care grants, and the rest of it on crisis loans. The amount being transferred to us, and remember there has been an overt attempt by the UK government to manage back expenditure on this, but that was the expenditure in 2010-11. The amount that is being proposed to transfer to us by the DWP is £23.7 million. We'll add 9.2 to that, which takes us up to just under £33 million, which is higher than any of the expenditure figures. The previous high was 2009-10, when the expenditure was just over 30 million. So these are, I'm happy to share these figures with you.
I think that would be useful, because if there is concern out there, it's better that we're all working from the same figures, so that people don't think that the fund is either greater or larger than maybe one group thinks it's a greater figure and are advising people accordingly, when I think if we can bottom out exactly what's available, then I think most organisations would appreciate knowing exactly what the change is, so that they can...
Well, I'll send these figures. I don't think there's any reason why we can't share these figures with the committee, so I'll get them off to you.
That'd be really helpful, Cabinet Secretary. Another question, you probably are aware of the news coming out of Northern Ireland yesterday. There appears to have been, I don't know whether you call them concessions or agreed arrangements between the DWP and the Northern Ireland Assembly Government. Can you give us a view as to whether that will have any impact here? There appears to be, in some cases, delays that have been negotiated. Will that potentially have any impact on the implementation of anything here that people are working towards?
I am aware of this, and forgive me if I may not yet have all of the fine detail of it, but as I understand it, what has been agreed in Northern Ireland, the main changes are that the housing cost element of universal credit will go direct to landlords rather than to the claimant. Payment of universal credit will be capable of being split between two parties in the household, and payment of universal credit could be payable twice per month. Now, these are all changes I would want to see Scotland having the opportunity to implement as well. And we'll certainly use the Northern Irish example to strengthen our hand. I should say to the committee, of course, that Northern Ireland is at an advantage here because constitutionally they are responsible for benefits, whereas we are not. So it is an argument for devolved parliaments having more powers, in my view, because they have a much stronger position over this than we do. But we'll be arguing the case. These particular changes certainly go to the heart of some of the concerns I have, not about the principle of the change to universal credit, but some of the impacts of the operation of universal credit.
Yeah, I think the committee would agree that we support you in those endeavours to try and have the same parity in terms of these amendments to the situation in Northern Ireland being implemented here, because the evidence that we took from all of the organisations would have indicated that that was the type of solutions that they would have looked towards to try and address some of the concerns about the implementation of the changes, and especially in terms of the money going to landlords. That's a major concession I think they've had. I think
I'm just reading the summary here. I think the Northern Irish Minister has now also said he'll introduce universal credit from April 2014 as opposed to October. But the difference between him and me is he's got the ability to say I will or I won't introduce it, whereas we don't. So that's one of the key differences, but we will continue to exert as much influence as we can.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay, can I thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. Is there anything that you want to add before we conclude this? No,
I'll make sure these bits of information, I'll make sure we get to you. I think the final thing to say was when I first agreed to come here at round about this time, I had hoped we would be in a more advanced position with the passported benefits. So when we do have the additional information we seek, I'm happy to come back at that stage to flesh out some of the things we've not been able to talk about today.
Okay, thanks very much. Okay, can I suspend the meeting for a few minutes to allow the officials to change over and give the Cabinet Secretary a chance to take a breather? Can I open up the meeting again, and as per our first item of business, invite the Cabinet Secretary to make a brief opening statement and then invite the committee to ask questions.
Thanks, Convener, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to discuss the draft budget with the committee. I think all of the members of the committee would agree with me when I say that the support we give to the most vulnerable in our societies one of the defining measures of a civilised society. I'm very clear that the welfare reforms being pursued by the UK government don't reflect our values. I don't think they reflect the values. I know they don't reflect the values of the Scottish Government. I don't think they reflect the values of the Scottish people. I certainly am concerned with the repeated anxieties that I hear from experts, from professionals and from worried individuals and families about the impact of the reforms. You will have heard, we've discussed before, that the estimate of the reduction in benefit spend in Scotland will be around £2.5 billion by 2015. And I think it's fair to say that these cuts, alongside the changes to the way benefits will be delivered, some of which we touched on briefly at the end of the last session, will have significant impacts on vulnerable people in Scotland. We saw just last week the report from the Children's Society, Citizens Advice and Disability Rights UK, which suggested that across the UK 450,000 disabled people could be worse off under the new system, up to the tune of up to £58 a week. I mean, that's a massive implication. We will continue to make the case to the UK government that they must do more to protect the vulnerable. We will also be looking to influence the DWP in terms of the work they are doing to prepare people for the changes, because I've also heard concerns that they're not doing enough in that respect to educate people and prepare people for the changes that are coming down the track. Obviously, though, we have to accept the reality that change is happening. We need to be prepared as far as we can to do as much as we can as a Scottish Government to help protect vulnerable people. And we will do that. But I have to be very clear, as I've been with this committee before, that we are not in a position to mitigate every impact of the changes being pursued by the UK government. It is not possible to do that in a fixed budget, and you know, I dare say people, including members of the committee, will be looking to push us to do more. I understand that, but there are limits to what we can reasonably do, because there are consequences to this that are simply beyond the ability of us to mitigate within the budget that we have. And I believe very strongly that what's happening with welfare reform demonstrates very powerfully why this Parliament should control welfare issues rather than the UK government. That said, we are doing as much as we can with the limited powers and resources we do have. I've already discussed this morning, so I won't go into detail again on this. We've taken the decision to supplement funding for the new Scottish Welfare Fund, and we're working with COSLA and local authorities to develop the arrangements for that. We've also previously taken the decision with our partners in local government to mitigate the 10% funding cut in local government in council tax benefit funding for 2013-14. Both of these are very significant investments by the government in areas of devolved responsibility. But the size of the UK government cuts and the scale of the changes they're introducing do mean that many challenges remain for individuals across Scotland. In response to the introduction of universal credit and the other UK welfare changes, I think the committee does raise some very important points. I think we need to build consensus around these areas of greatest impact. We need to continue to challenge the DWP and continue to work together where we can in response. We need to consider the impact of welfare reform on specific sectors where we have devolved responsibility, and the impact on, for example, local government, housing and the NHS is potentially considerable, as it is on the third sector. And I'm very committed to working with these delivery partners across all of these areas. We're engaged with COSLA on a number of fronts, including pilot projects to help councils prepare for the introduction of universal credit, and we've also worked with COSLA and other stakeholders on a housing benefit reform action plan. And from that, we've seen funding to the housing option hubs to develop and share good practice, funding for training for social landlords, and for a dedicated housing and welfare reform staff resource within COSLA. So we are, and I'll end on this point, we are doing everything we can, and we're committed to continuing to do everything we reasonably can. But as members will appreciate, there is a limit to the powers and to the resources that we have. But I take very seriously the obligations we have to our poorest and most vulnerable citizens, and we will continue to help them and protect them as much as possible.
Once again, Cabinet Secretary, I'll open up this time just by asking a general question, a very important one, and possibly ask you or invite you to give us a specific example so that we have it on the record, because in terms of equality duties of the Parliament, we have to ensure that the budget is focused on those groups who are most disproportionately disadvantaged. So can you, in terms of that, possibly in terms of disabled people or lone single families, whatever, give us some specific examples of how this will meet those duties?
Well, I mean, I think the examples I've been speaking about already this morning fall into that category, although the 9.2 million I've spoken about in the social fund doesn't yet appear discreetly in the draft budget. It obviously will do by the time we get to the end of this process. That will very directly help the kind of groups of people you talk about, disabled people, lone parents, elderly people and people who suffer social and economic disadvantage. The funding we've directed to local authorities for next year to mitigate the council tax benefit cut similarly will assist people in all of those groups. Our housing money that goes to local authorities, obviously for distribution to housing associations, etc. You know, that in terms of how that is spent through local housing strategies should have a focus on helping people in those groups. The money we spend on third sector organisations similarly. So across the whole budget, obviously within a budget I know very well from previous responsibilities, within the massive health budget, you know, by definition, the health budget is helping people in examples of disadvantage, but there are specific elements of the health budget, for example, Keep Well funding, which are specifically targeted at people in areas of disadvantage. So there are, you know, many examples of how our budget seeks to help those, and in doing so meet the obligations we've got under the Equalities Act.
Thanks very much, Cabinet Secretary. I think it was useful to get that on the record to show that we've asked the questions in terms of equalities, because I think that's an important issue that we should all keep a focus on. I'll open it up to colleagues who might want to ask questions in other areas. Jamie?
Thank you, Convener. One of the things that came through quite strongly in evidence, Cabinet Secretary, mainly through third sector organisations, was a concern about the impact of welfare reform changes generally on other policy areas such as housing, such as an increased demand on health. Has there been any assessment of the impact in those areas of the budget?
Obviously, and I don't want to, and I don't like sounding as if I'm answering too many questions but we don't have enough information. But that, unfortunately, in this case is true. We are assessing and will continue to assess the impact as well as we can. But right now, I can't tell you what the level of universal credit is going to be. I therefore can't, you know, accurately assess what the impact is going to be on different groups. But we will continue with our partners to assess that as effectively as we can as we go through this whole process. I think from what I do know right now, I think it is inevitable we will have impacts on the health service. You know, if you look at the cuts within the £2.5 billion I spoke about, you know, the portion of that is cuts on disability benefits, I think it is inevitable that will impact on the health service. You know, if you look at the changes to housing benefit, we will all be able to tell these stories from our own constituency surgeries. I had just one example of somebody who came to my surgery a couple of weeks ago, a disabled man living in a 2-bedroom housing association house who, you know, because he will now be deemed to be under occupying that house, will lose 14% of his housing benefit come April next year. That's, you know, £60 a month he will have to find, or the housing association will have to fill the gap, or he will lose his home. So there are impacts on all of these services. The third sector will see an increased demand for their services. So we need to assess the impact of that as we get the information to do so, and work as effectively as we can with all of these organisations to make sure they're as prepared for dealing with this impact as they possibly can be.
I mean, I think all of us around the table would appreciate it's very early days, and it really, suppose you can't quantify it now, but there is a commitment then to do that on an ongoing basis and try and quantify it in future years. That's useful. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Mr. Neal. And sort of picking up from that point, Cabinet Secretary, I mean, I do share the view, which becomes no surprise, that obviously if we had control over all of our resources like a normal country, we could be looking at a completely different discussion this morning on a budget which was a normal budget and not a devolved budget. But anyway, having said that, and picking up on Jamie Hepburn's point, in terms of ongoing work to look at potential impacts, I just wonder what potential focus there could be on looking at the position specifically in rural areas, because of course, in addition to all the similar shared problems that there would be with people living in urban areas, in addition, of course, there's the added cost of transport, and that has a further impact, negative impact in terms of the already known negative impacts of these welfare cuts. I just wonder what kind of work perhaps could be undertaken in that respect.
No, I think that's a very good point, and we will ensure that the impacts on different parts of the country, that we are trying to capture that in the work that we do. There will be significant, I would imagine, differences in impact between rural areas and urban areas. I would imagine, although I'm not basing this on any hard evidence I've seen, but I would imagine, for example, a problem that is a big problem in urban areas about the ability of housing providers to move people from houses that they will be deemed to be under-occupying into smaller houses will be more acute in rural areas where the choices of housing provision are more limited than they would be in the city of Glasgow, for example. So, it's important, and I can give the assurance that we will try to capture those differences as much as we can. I mean, if you take the housing benefit changes just as an example, because we do have more clarity here in terms of some of the changes that are coming down the road. We're looking at potentially 95,000 households in the social rented sector being affected by the under-occupancy rules, losing on average between £27 and £65 a month. That's going to have a one-off cost to the Scottish economy of £87 million, as we estimate, and will remove somewhere in the region of £55 million a year thereafter. So these are enormous impacts on individuals and on the economy. We need to keep updating that as we can, and as you rightly say, make sure that we're taking account of differences in different parts of the country.
Thank you.
Karen.
Thank you, Convener, and I'm going to stick to the housing topic because I think it is one of the ones where folks are particularly worried about possible impacts. For me, Convener, having talked to a number of people round about this and a number of organisations, the supply factor is really worrying people to a huge degree. The over-occupancy scenario where folks will lose money if they continue to stay in current homes, I don't think that there's a recognition from the Westminster Government about housing supply. And we've had a drive here in recent years to build much more family housing in terms of the socially affordable sector. And beyond that, we have, in a lot of places, created homes for life so that people can stay in that property throughout their years. And now we're basically saying that that's all going to change. And you will have to go into a single room in some cases, a single bedroom property in some cases. I wonder if I could ask the Cabinet Secretary if any analysis has been done by local authorities and shared with herself round about one-bedroom properties. Because from my own experience in my own city, and I know it will be different elsewhere, a lot of the one-bedroom properties that there are flatted accommodation. And a lot of the folks who will have to move are people with disabilities who may not be able to cope with flatted accommodation. And I wonder if, in terms of the housing surveys that are carried out on a regular basis by local authorities, if any of that work has been done to see exactly what the situation is.
If I can, on a national level, we've given some money to the Chartered Institute of Housing to deliver some training, awareness raising for social landlords, which covers issues like modelling impacts to estimate, potential loss of income, identify people at greatest need, looking at how they adapt their services, amend their allocations processes, etc. So that's, we're helping to that extent at a national level. I know from my own constituency experience, and others will know this as well, that local landlords are working very hard to understand the position in their own area and think through how they respond to that. But we very quickly come up against the problem you've described. There is a shortage of one-bedroomed property in Scotland, and that is to some extent the result of a very deliberate policy, which, as you say, has been to provide family accommodation and housing for life for people. So housing associations are not going to find it easy to move people into accommodation that they will then not be deemed to be under-occupying. I mean, if I take the example I cited from my own constituency a few moments ago, the individual in question would be happy to move to a smaller house, but the housing association doesn't have one sitting there to offer him. If he does get offered one, it's likely to be out of the area he lives in, which will take him away from the family who help care for him because of his disabilities, and therefore that will put an extra burden on some other part of the statutory services. So I know the committee previously discussed this with DWP officials. I agree with you. I don't think there is, whether it's deliberate or just a failure to understand this, I don't know, but that there is not a sufficiently developed understanding of what the implications of this are. Frequently you get hit with, well, people will change their behaviour, or they'll take in a lodger, or these things don't seem to me to take proper account of the impacts on, not just the impacts on people's budgets, the impacts on people's lives, because it's actual lives we're talking about here. And I guess it's one of the areas of this whole change that disturbs me most, because it is about potentially uprooting people from a way of life, their communities, and taking them away from all of that, and the impact that can have on people physically and mentally, it could be really quite significant.
Convener, I think for, again, many of us, we represent constituencies where there is quite a large private rented sector, particularly in the area of one-bedroom properties. And I think with the changes, and certainly some organisations in my own area, like the Aberdeen Cyrenians, are saying that this is inevitable, that private landlords will stop renting to folks who are on housing benefit, because they're not going to be paid directly, and there will be that slashing of the budget. I wonder, in terms of discussions that there have been with private sector landlord organisations, what are they saying about all of this?
Just as a point of clarity, and can provide the committee with more information on this, some of the changes we're talking about only apply at the moment to the social rented sector, mainly because some of them have already applied to the private rented sector already. So not all of these changes will have the same implication on the private rented sector as they will on the social rented sector. So I think you're right to point out the need for us, because even if it is only impacting the social rented sector, it may well have a knock-on effect into demand on the private rented sector. And so you're absolutely right that we need to ensure that they are part of our discussions. But I think the immediate impact of the changes that are taking effect from next year are on the social rented sector.
But in terms of the changes to the social rented sector, particularly if folk are having to downsize,
absolutely,
there's an inevitable impact
that's what I mean.
on the private
sector. It has a knock-on effect.
Yeah.
They're not changes that directly affect, in all cases, the private rented sector, but you're absolutely right, it has that knock-on effect to the private rented sector.
And are we having discussions with the private landlords associations as well, round about what is going on? I can
feed back to the committee on exactly what interaction we've had, but I certainly take your point on board that it's important they are part of the discussions.
One final question, and that's round about, again, the downsizing. Many people rely on an extra additional bedroom for many reasons. Families that have split up, who father or mother may only have their kids 2 or 3 days a week, that contact may go if they don't have that extra bedroom. Some folk, because of physical disabilities, require that extra space for whatever reason. And of course, there is the aspects that you've pointed out already about folks with mental health problems who often require additional space. Are we aware of the DWP doing any analysis whatsoever in this regard in terms of the impacts of this proposed policy?
I'm happy to check exactly what the DWP are doing on this and feedback to the committee. But you're right to point out, I mean, there are exemptions from this under-occupancy rule for disabled people who require a carer living with them. But of course, many disabled people won't be in that position, but they'll still need the extra space for some form of care. I think you're right about the impact on families, single parents who have their children for part of the week. You know, that could have a devastating impact. You know, I had another contact from somebody who has 2 daughters, both under 16, so they're deemed to have to share a room. One of this woman's daughters, though, has chronic conditions that keeps her up half the night, and you know, that's why she needs her own room. But under these rule changes, the rules will be applied there, and she'll lose benefit. So I said earlier on, and I'll say again, there are many aspects of the welfare changes that concern me. This one probably concerns me more than some of the others, because it is not just about, important though this is, it's not just about a budgetary impact for people, it's about potentially re-engineering the way people are living their lives. And you know, the impact of that is really quite distressing for very many people.
Thank you.
Ian.
Thanks, Convener. You said in your introductory remarks, Cabinet Secretary, that the Scottish Government can't fully mitigate all the consequences of welfare reform, and I think that's a very fair point. But I think the committee are interested in what you are doing to try and mitigate it, and indeed you've talked today about the additional £9 million for the Social Fund successor arrangement as part of that mitigation. And that doesn't appear in the draft budget, but as you say, it will at the end of the process. Another sum that doesn't appear in the draft budget, I think, is the Welfare Reform Contingency Fund, which your colleague Mr Swinney has said stands at £20 million. And my question is whether the £9 million towards the Scottish Welfare Fund is part of that 20 million, and if it is, how the remainder is likely to be allocated, or if it's not, how that 20 million might be allocated.
The contingency fund was, as you'll recall, what was used to mitigate the 10% council tax benefit, which is money now with local authorities for 2013 in order to allow them to do that. The 9.2 million, we will recast our budget plans in order to find the headroom to provide that money.
So there isn't any further contingency.
Well, we will continue to look at how, it doesn't give me any pleasure in saying this, but every pound we have to find in our budget to mitigate the impacts of policy changes being decided in another parliament is a pound that has to come from somewhere else. There is no, there is no kind of discrete pot of money that's not allocated to anything saying, fund for the mitigation of disastrous and wrong-headed policies of the UK government, unfortunately. So we have to balance our budget with that. And it would have to be a big fund if it was to do that. So we are trying to cast our budget as best as we can to do that. But, I can't sit here and I appreciate you've accepted this point. I can't sit here and say we can do that in every respect, because we have a fixed and declining budget, and, we need to look at where we can do that, and we will. I think there is more we can continue to talk to the third sector about how we help them deal with demand. I've had, as I think I said earlier on, had discussions with Citizens Advice about how they might organise themselves to deal with the increased demand and how we might be able to help them with that. So this is not a closed book. We will continue to look within the budgets we've set for the health service, for local government, although they're obviously in charge of their own budget, for the other strands of our budget. We will continue to look at how we spend that budget as best as possible to mitigate these impacts, but we don't have extra money to do this. It has to be taken from other parts of the budget.
I did accept, Cabinet Secretary, that you can't mitigate all of the changes. And I was simply pointing out that there was, in fact, a fund to mitigate the effects of wrong-headed policies, and I wondered how it had been
I know.
allocated.
I hope I've
but you've answered.
that.
But the point you make is true, that where you find £1 to mitigate the impact of welfare reform, wrong-headed welfare reform, it has to come from somewhere else. I mean, in the budget, there is a sum of £70 million which has been allocated to freeze the council tax, and in the draft budget, it says this will provide further protection to hard-pressed households across Scotland, many of whom have been affected by the economic downturn and UK welfare reform. But maximum council tax benefit, which you've also protected, is a passported benefit. So those who are in the welfare system won't pay council tax. So that's not really true, is it?
Well, yes, we have funded a council tax freeze to the tune of 70 million. Correct me if I'm wrong here, no doubt you will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think when you were standing to be First Minister, you wanted to spend £80 million a year on freezing the council tax.
For 2 years, yes.
Well, hey, okay, but I just don't accept that the answer to the policies of the UK government that are about to penalise vulnerable people is to put other people's council tax up, because people who are not in the welfare system also, are living on very constrained budgets just now. The council tax, when the previous administration was in power, previous administrations in power, went, through the roof. I don't think it's right to raise the council tax at this time. That used to be a point of agreement between us. I know it's now not a point of agreement between us because you have changed your mind on that, but that remains our position, and we'll continue to defend that position.
The council tax freeze was a point of agreement between us until the budget that we're discussing now, because what we had suggested at the time that you're referring to was that it should be maintained and properly funded for 2 years, but it couldn't sustainably be done before. But where we differ is that I have never claimed that a council tax freeze helped those affected by UK welfare reform, because I know that those who are in the welfare system, because of council tax benefit, don't pay council tax. So it may well benefit other households, but my question was, it isn't part of the support for those affected by the UK welfare reform, and the draft budget shouldn't say that it is.
Well, the point is, universal credit affects people who are in work and goes quite high up the income scale. So it's not that's one of the points of universal credit. It's not just an out of work benefit. So I think your point is actually wrong in that respect. But as I say, I'm happy to defend our position. You say you only wanted a council tax freeze for 2 years. I accept that was your position. Your party colleagues in Glasgow, as of May this year, promised to freeze it for another 5 years. So I think my position on council tax freeze, whether you think it's right or not, has been pretty consistent, and I think it's right, and I will continue to defend it, as I will continue to defend the policies that we will introduce to try to mitigate against the worst impacts of welfare reform. And I would hope on the latter, if not in the former, we are able to build a bit of consensus around this table and in the wider Parliament.
Linda.
Yeah, I'll move to something that everyone admits to agreeing with. One of the things I think is absolutely super that this government has been doing, and indeed aiming to do, is preventative spend. I think it's been a major shift in how public expenditure has been looked at in this country. I would tie that into with the work being done on, for example, the Change Fund, which is really about trying to join up services so that people get maximum benefit from it. And I wonder what concerns you might have that because everything that we're talking about here today is very reactive to things completely out with the control of the government here, that we have to ameliorate circumstances for people, what danger there is of undoing the good work that's already been started on preventative spending and indeed expanding that the way that we wished.
I think that's a very good question, and it is a concern I have. I think at one and the same time, what's happening with the welfare reforms make it all the more important that we invest in preventative spend to try to prevent people getting into the position where they're reliant on the kind of benefits that are being reduced. So that becomes all the more important. But at the same time, it gets harder to do it because, I've just said today we're going to spend £9 million supplementing a fund to help people that will be effectively penalised by these reforms. I'd rather be spending that £9 million in a way that is much more preventative. Incidentally, I should say part of the social fund, the community care grant, does fall into the category of preventative spend because it is about, you know, supporting people to live independently. But crisis grants don't; they are very reactive. And obviously, as we see the impact of welfare reform increasing pressure on some of our statutory services, then it makes it harder for us to be as successful as we would want to about preventative spend. And again, I think it's just an example of the disjoint in policy you get when you've got one government deciding some things and another government deciding others, and the two policy directions clash. And I don't think that is the right way of conducting public policy.
Okay. Yeah.
I want to return to the issue of council tax benefit, if I may, Cabinet Secretary. Isn't it incorrect to say that all those people in receipt of council tax benefit don't pay council tax? Wouldn't it be rather more correct to say some of those in receipt of council tax benefit pay no council tax, but some still are eligible to pay a portion of council tax, and couldn't you say that those people benefit by a council tax freeze?
Right. Yes, I think is the succinct answer to that question. Yes, absolutely. I mean, I've already answered Dean Gray's points on council tax, but I do think it's wrong to say that a council tax freeze has no benefit at all in terms of helping people in these categories. And, you know, I've already said why I think the council tax freeze is right, and I'll continue to argue that case.
I'm sure you will.
Before coming on to my final question, Cabinet Secretary, since we're just on the subject, can you tell us in the budget how much Glasgow would have been penalised for the next 5 years had it not agreed to freeze the council tax?
Well, I think if Glasgow was not agreeing to freeze the council tax, it's not Glasgow that's been penalised, it's the council taxpayers of Glasgow that are being penalised by higher council tax. But there was a financial penalty,
well, you know, Cabinet Secretary for
it's not a financial penalty, it's an agreement with councils that if they freeze the council tax, they get funded to freeze the council tax, but if they don't agree to freeze the council tax, they don't get funded for freezing the council tax. Why would you fund a local authority for doing something that they're not agreeing to do? I mean, that might be the way the previous administration operated, but it's not the way this administration operates. It's not a penalty, it's an agreement. And incidentally, Glasgow City Council Glasgow Labour Party, not Glasgow City Council, went into an election in May this year voluntarily agreeing to freeze the council tax for 5 years. In other words, beyond the life of this Parliament. Now, maybe they were just assuming the SNP would continue to be in government, or otherwise, maybe they were making a conscious choice to do that. So I suspect some of these questions might be better directed to Glasgow Labour Party than to me. Thankfully, I don't speak for Glasgow Labour Party.
What people do want us to ask this morning is about the impact of the welfare reform changes. And the question, you know, Kevin Stewart raised the issue of the pressure that's going to come on the private sector, but there is a lot of concern about the amount of increase that might occur in terms of rent arrears for social landlords. Can you point us in the direction within the budget of where support for social landlords is going to come in order to address that situation, should it reach the levels that people fear might actually occur?
Well, we will work with housing providers to try and avoid that situation arising and try to work with them. But I think this falls into the category of something I cannot sit here and say that we can completely mitigate. You know, I cannot sit here and say that we can fund housing associations to fill a gap caused by rent arrears that results from a policy instituted by the UK government. I can't do that. What I can say is that we will continue to work with housing providers to minimise the risk of that happening and to work with them to try to deal with it to the extent that it does happen.
Okay. And in terms of support for organisations like Citizens Advice or those who are providing support and advocacy for people who find themselves adversely affected, is there a particular budget stream that's been identified to support them, not just in terms of advice from yourselves or trying to develop capacity building within that sector, but actually financial support to allow them to do that?
Well, you'll see there's the budget line in the budget, the miscellaneous welfare line, which has £3 million in the next 2 years, which will be used for some research, supporting capacity, response and mitigation work. I've already also said that we've had some discussions with Citizens Advice about looking to work with them and see what more we can do to support them to plan for the increased demand. Obviously, we, already, not always directly, often through local authorities and other routes, fund these organisations for the work they currently do, and we'll, be looking to see if there are ways within all the constraints I've spoken about of supporting them better as they deal with increased demand.
I don't see any other questions, Cabinet Secretary. Can I thank you again for giving up your time this morning to come and speak to us. As in the past, you've sent us information supplementary to the discussions that we've had, and you've given a commitment to do that in some specific areas already this morning. But if anything else should occur to you or your officials that might be beneficial to the committee, they would be gratefully received as well.
Yeah, so absolutely give you a commitment to do that.
Thanks very much, Cabinet Secretary. Thank you. And can I suspend for a few minutes until we come to our next part of the meeting?